everyone. I just wanted to welcome you to our lecture today about King Sennacherib. King Sennacherib, or Sanchiru Sin Ahi-Iriba, is one of Assyria's greatest kings, one of Assyria's most important kings, and also one of the most notorious kings in Assyrian and biblical history. A king that has gone down in history as being a very, very difficult king for the rest of the nations surrounding Assyria. So why is that? Well, let's look at Assyrian history and put Sennacherib in context here. First thing is, we need to understand that the Assyrian Empire lasted for over 7 centuries, one of the longest reigning empires. Certainly, going back to what we call the Middle Assyrian period, the Assyrians began to grow and to establish themselves into a regional power that other nations had never seen before. Why was this unusual? It was unusual because all the empires that came and went largely were dynasties. Once the dynasty was over, in other words, the king, the son, maybe the grandson, such as the case of Sargon of Akkad, and Naram-Sin, his grandson. Once the dynasty was over, the kingdom and the empire didn't last. Well, for the first time in history, we have an unusual situation, and that is something called the Assyrian Empire. And it starts really during the Middle Assyrian period, which is about 1500 years before Christ. So, how powerful was the Assyrian Empire? Well, in its beginning, especially with the reign of Ashur-uballit I in the 14th century, the Assyrians were enough of a power to put Egypt and the Hittites and the people of Babylon on notice, as well as the Hurrians and others, that the world was changing. The Near East was changing. And eventually, over a period of hundreds of years, and you got to remember, all empires lasted about 200-300 years, with the exception of Rome. The Assyrian Empire grew to include the entire Near East and North Africa, with a penetrating influence deep into Iran and even Central Asia on the one hand, on the east, north into the Caucasus, into what is today Russia, and then west towards the Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean Basin, in particular the Eastern Mediterranean, but also to include influence into the Western Mediterranean. That is the period that historians call the Neo-Assyrian period. So the Neo-Assyrian period lasts about 300 years, and of course the segmenting of the periods from the Middle Assyrian period to the Neo-Assyrian period is something that historians have done, but for the Assyrians themselves, they see continuity from the Old Assyrian period, 2000 years BC, into the Neo-Assyrian period, where the Assyrians begin to dominate the Near East, and into the Middle Assyrian period and into the Neo-Assyrian period, where the entire Near East, what they call the known world, is dominated. So this was the world that Sennacherib was born into. And what do we know about Sennacherib? Was he a villain, as is sometimes he's referred to? Was he an innovative builder? Was he a strategic genius or a great engineer by his own words? Was he simply a ruthless conqueror? Or could we really truly say that Sennacherib was a great king, one of the greatest of Assyrian kings? Well, Sennacherib became a very important figure, largely because of the Bible. He took a central role in the Bible because in Kings 2, it refers to the role that Assyria had in influencing Judea. The history of Judah is rooted in the situation of the Assyrians, specifically King Sennacherib. And with regard to Judah, it's important to remember that Jerusalem is a central city in Judah. And when Sennacherib comes up against the city of Jerusalem, as recounted in Kings 2 specifically, the angel of the Lord is said to have come down and slaughtered 181,000 Assyrian soldiers. This was punishment against the Assyrians, specifically against Sennacherib, because the Assyrians came up against Jerusalem. Now, this is the Old Testament record. And from the Old Testament record, we have a number of writers portraying King Sennacherib as a kind of a villain in history. The sort of person you wouldn't want to know, because the Assyrian, in the words of Lord Byron, whose real name was George Gordon, the Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. So King Sennacherib and the Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold to Judah against Jerusalem, and was slaughtered because, in the words of Lord Byron, the Assyrians had the Gentile had melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. So the Lord looked upon the Assyrians, according to Lord Byron, and they were gone all of a sudden. It's kind of a miraculous story in history. And of course, before Lord Byron in the 1800s, long before that, Sennacherib, because of the Bible, became a well-known figure, and he was portrayed in various artworks, such as in Peter Paul Rubens' artwork and others, as kind of a villain of the Bible, where the Lord takes action against him. Now, this is not the main point of our lecture today, is to go into biblical history about Sennacherib, other than to make reference that the reason we know Sennacherib to be kind of a mean guy in history is because of the Bible. But this is a misunderstanding of the Bible, and it is rather inexcusable that people who are scholars would also view the Assyrians as sort of the villains of history. This is an unfair assessment of the Assyrians. And people like Dominic Levine, who is a senior research fellow at Trinity College in Cambridge, have made certain statements, specifically in his book, In the Shadow of the Gods, the Emperor in World History. He talks about Assyrian kings, and among them Sennacherib, that they seem to have pursued an exceptionally ruthless system of exploiting conquered territories. Official ideology stressed allegiance to the Assyrian god Ashur, in whose service conquest and plunder were virtues. A, quote, dark blend of religious and militaristic ideology placed the king in the center of the universe and presented Assyria as a land enclosed by a ring of evil, savage torture, and execution of anyone who opposed its rule. Now, all of this is extremely unfair. It's unfair because it does not reflect the true role in history played by the Assyrians, specifically Assyrian kings. Were they ruthless? Well, when they were running an empire, as all kings in history, of course, they could be expected to be ruthless. But it's rather unfair to portray their entire religious beliefs, all of their religious beliefs, their conquest, their empire, in terms of almost an ideological goal to pursue evil and bad works in history. This is certainly not the case. So what do we know from the historical record? What do we know from the texts written in the primary sources that we look at? In other words, in cuneiform sources or scholarly writings, what do we know about Sennacherib in Judah? This very chapter in history that is portrayed in the way that we said in the Bible, and then which inspired further writings by Western poets and artists to portray Sennacherib in a very bad light. So the kingdom of Judah was one of the kingdoms in the Levant. It was a rather small kingdom next to the Philistine states and next to the kingdom of Israel. We have to remember that the kingdom of Judah was separate from the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Israel and Samaria was taken over by King Sargon II, largely because as a vassal state it was not cooperating with the Assyrians. And so the Assyrians penetrated all the way to the kingdom of Judah. And at one point, Egypt had interests in the Levant, largely for economic goals, and that is to pursue, for example, cedar trees or other materials in the area. And so Egypt begins to exert influence in this area, perhaps offering smaller states an opportunity to do better, as it were, than to be vassal states for Assyria. And so Sennacherib meets up in a situation like this, and he understands that Judah, along with other nations in the area, is possibly making a deal to gather together a coalition which is tied to Marduk-apla-iddina, a Chaldean leader in Babylon, a rebel leader, with Elam in the heart of Iran, in southwestern Iran, and with Egypt, which is now being ruled by the Nubian pharaohs, what are known as the Black Pharaohs. Sennacherib refers to this alliance as an unholy alliance, a kitru. The word kitru also means kitra or qutra in Assyrian, modern Assyrian, which means a knot or a coming together of bringing together, as in, for example, tying a knot in a rope. So this kitru, which is an obstacle of sorts for Sennacherib, has to be handled. And so Sennacherib moves against every single one of these people who challenge the reign of Assyria. It is thought that he is wholly unprepared after his father passes away. He is, of course, the son of Sargon II. But Sennacherib really shows that he is a very able leader. And so he presses forward into the heart of Iran, into southern Mesopotamia, into Judah, and challenges Egypt's hold on the Levant. So the very first campaign, he tells us that he brought about the defeat of Marduk-apla-iddina II. And this is the king of Karduniash, which is a term that Assyrians used for Babylonia at one time. Otherwise, they used terms such as Somar and Ekked, Ekked being the more central part of Babylonia, and Somar being the southern part. There's also a reference to the Sea Land, which is the very southern part by what's called the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf in some cases. So Sennacherib brings about the defeat and of the Chaldean rebels in Babylon, and he also brings the defeat of the tribes who rebelled. And along with the subjugation of certain tribes, he makes an alliance with other tribes. And so Babylon is brought under his reign and under his full control. And he tells us in his own writing, with the dust of their feet covering the wide heavens like a mighty storm, they drew up in battle array before me on the bank of the Tigris. They blocked my passage and offered battle. I put on my coat of mail, my helmet, emblem of victory, I placed upon my head. My great battle chariot, which brings low the foe, I hurly mounted in the anger of my heart. The mighty bow which Ashur had given me, I seized in my hands. The javelin piercing to the life I grasped. I stopped their advance, succeeding in surrounding them. I decimated the enemy host with arrow and spear. 150,000 of their warriors I cut down with the sword. So when necessary, if diplomacy did not work for the ancient Assyrian kings, battle and war were the resort. And that's exactly what Sennacherib did in southern Babylonia. In the second campaign, Sennacherib goes into Iranian territory and wanders into the high mountains, into what he calls the difficult terrain. He rides on horseback where his personal chariot was not able to be carried. In the very rugged terrain, he roams about, like in his own words, like a wild bull. And so he stabilizes these areas and is able to take care of the needs, some of whom have caused trouble for the Assyrian Empire, for the center of the empire, and he brings peace into the area. In his third campaign, which becomes very important, and this is where we want to focus our discussion, he defeats the king of Sidon, who, upon hearing of the approach of Sennacherib, flees into the sea and disappeared, in the words of Sennacherib, and the cities of the Levant eventually surrender. And the Levant, of course, is today Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and all the way up to Egypt. And so the land of Moab, Edom, and various kingdoms of the Levant pay tribute. King of Ashkelon, who had not paid tribute, is taken prisoner to Assyria with his family, and a former king is assigned. Now, there was a practice among the Assyrians that they would look for certain ruling families, certain royal families who were perhaps dispossessed of their power, and they would be replacing the king who was taken out, as it were. So in this case, in the king of Ashkelon, which is in present-day Gaza, the king who does not listen to the Assyrians, who does not abide by the oath sworn treaty, a sworn treaty, he is taken out and replaced by not an ordinary person, but by a person who is of a royal blood. In Ekron, when it's necessary, he assaults Ekron. He has to use military force. I assaulted Ekron and killed the official and patricians who had committed the crime and hung their bodies on poles surrounding the city, to make sure that people understand a violation of the oath given to the king of Assyria is a very serious thing. But then he tells us at the same time, the common citizens who were guilty of minor crimes I considered prisoners of war. In other words, the Assyrians didn't simply slaughter people. The rest of them, those who were not accused of crimes and misbehavior, I released. In other words, people who did not participate in the rebellion and who had nothing to do with the rebellion, even though they were a part of a particular city that was targeted, they were released because they did not engage in misbehavior. And again, I made Padi their king, come from Jerusalem, and set him as their lord on the throne, imposing upon him the tribute due to me as overlord. So as long as you kept your payments, your tax, as it were, you were paying your taxes, you were paying your dues to the center of the empire, you would be offered protection, and the empire would be at peace. The governors and nobles of Ekron arrest Padi, who Sennacherib had placed on the throne, because he is loyal to Assyria, and hand him over to Hezekiah of Judah. And this is where the hostilities begin, in a hostile manner, as if he is an enemy, according to Sennacherib. The governors and nobles then form a union, what Sennacherib calls a chutru, with Egypt and Kush, forces without number, according to Sennacherib, because they become frightened on account of the villainous act they had committed. In the plain of El Teke, today's Gilead in Israel, their battle lines were drawn up and they sharpened their weapons. So Sennacherib is able to handle that situation. But what's important to know, to have a better understanding of the biblical sources, is that the Bible and the Old Testament is not really saying Sennacherib is an evil king who is cruel and ruthless, because the alliance that Judah seeks with Egypt is something that biblical prophets also do not agree with. So, for example, Isaiah tells the Judeans, "O rebellious children, says the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, who make an alliance, but against my will, adding sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my counsel, to take refuge in the protection of the Pharaoh and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt." So what's important here is to understand that the biblical sources which gave rise, that we were talking about earlier, gave rise to the writings of Western poets and Western artists who portrayed King Sennacherib in a bad light. We're not simply, these passages are not simply straightforward or black and white. In other words, King Sennacherib is a bad ancient Assyrian king and he is ruthless and so on. No, you have here Isaiah who calls upon the people of Israel in a show of a very kind of nuanced understanding of the situation. Some people in Judah did not agree with the policies of Judah in causing problems with the Assyrian Empire and siding with Egypt. And so this is an example of, you could say, kind of a complicated understanding of the situation and not a simple understanding as many authors in the 18th and 19th century understood and portrayed. So the Assyrians approach Jerusalem, and what happens is this, that the Assyrians tell the Judeans that they should surrender. And the situation is very bad, and the Assyrians speak in a language that the Judeans understand. They speak in Hebrew, although they're asked to speak in Aramaic. They nevertheless speak Hebrew because they tell the people on the wall of Jerusalem that we want everyone to understand, and the reason is because we want everybody who is going to suffer to understand what is being done here. When the leaders in Jerusalem understand, according to the Bible, they tore their clothes in despair and they went to see the king and told him what the Assyrian chief of staff had said. Now, this situation goes back to the relationship that Assyria had with the Philistine cities and with other cities in the Levant, and that is that Assyria had a kind of a complicated relationship between center and periphery. The Assyrians were a growing, powerful state empire, and Egypt was getting in the way. And when certain rulers behaved in a way that allied them with Egypt, the Assyrians were able to take action and to bring order to the region again. And the Assyrians dominated this area for hundreds of years, despite the fact that Egypt sought to have influence in the area. Egypt's influence was older than Assyria, but Assyrian influence for hundreds of years dominated the Levant, and this was the age of the Assyrian Empire, and Egypt was not able to challenge the Assyrians in the Levant. Now, in one particular case, the Egyptian pharaoh sends back a person who is seeking asylum, Yamani. He goes to Egypt to escape from the Assyrians, but the Egyptians, being fearful of the reaction of the Assyrians, send this prisoner back in manacles and handcuffs. And the reason is because it's a gesture of goodwill towards Assyria, because Kush, or Nubia, which dominates Egypt during this time, is afraid of the Assyrians and afraid of Assyrian power coming down the Levant, and it's choosing to use diplomacy rather than warfare. This policy changes when the Nubians become more powerful and the pharaohs start to gain confidence in their own country, in Lower and Upper Egypt. They are, of course, from Upper Egypt, which is in Nubia. And they begin to influence the entire land of Egypt, and they begin to eye the Levant as a source of influence because, as we said before, there are resources to be had here. The relationship with Assyria begins to deteriorate during the time of, actually earlier than Sennacherib, but at least during Sennacherib's time, because Egypt had sought diplomatic relations with Assyria, but during the time of the war or conflict with Judah, Egypt is now confronting Assyria. Gaza decides to stay neutral, and it is rewarded, but Ekron and Ashdod had profited from a new arrangement under Sennacherib. These Philistine cities were important for trade and international politics to the Assyrians, and so the Assyrians treat them with kid gloves, as it were. The treatment for certain cities of the Levant is for exemplary purposes, so that others do not violate the law. But when it's necessary, the Assyrians also use diplomatic gestures to try to resolve problems with certain people in the Levant. Now let's stop and understand the situation from a theory of international politics, as outlined the realist theory of international politics, rather than understanding the Assyrians from, say, either the biblical perspective or the perspective of certain historians who tend to see in the outlook of the Assyrian Empire as something evil or unnecessary cruelty. What's happening here is that as Assyria grows in power and as Egypt is gaining confidence, you have certain smaller states in between, and these smaller states in between begin to jockey for a better position vis-a-vis Assyria or Egypt. And so some of them are reluctant to cooperate with Assyria, and they will suffer the consequences. As stated by Professor John Mearsheimer, great powers look for opportunities to gain power at each other's expense. And that is exactly what's happening between Egypt and Assyria. Multipolar systems are more war-prone than our bipolar systems. What that means is, as soon as you have situations where there are many people rising to the top, not just two powers which are balancing each other, but you have other, perhaps smaller powers trying to gain power, such as the case of the cities in Gaza or Sidon or Judah, then these situations are much more war-prone. And so that's what we have in the situation of Assyria facing Judah, or Judah trying to face Assyria. Each of these conflicts was a great power rivalry, and each cast a long shadow over every part of the globe. And of course, here, Professor Mearsheimer is talking about World War II, but it's important to see patterns in history over and over again. And so what we have here, although obviously it's not World War II, it's not Europe, it's a different time and place, but the theories of power politics, 9 times out of 10, is going to match. Although in different times, of different historical times and different geographic settings, it's going to match. So the same as great powers during the First World War and during the Second World War were in a relationship with each other, Egypt and Assyria are in effect in a similar theoretical, abstract, you could say, situation. Sennacherib, of course, has given us his narratives. You can take a look at this prism, what's called a prism, a cuneiform prism, written in a great detail and beautiful writing style, cuneiform style, at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute. So we have a primary source, as it were, and this primary source is able to be read by us because this is written almost in the hand of the Assyrian king or is being dictated by the Assyrian king. Now, we know about Sennacherib from certain other persons, but it's important to know Sennacherib based on his understanding of himself. How did he view himself? Did he view himself as a ruthless leader who was shattering the confidence of other nations around him? Or did he, in his own words, view himself as the guardian of the right, lover of justice, who lends support, who comes to the aid of the weak? So, obviously, every leader in history, every leader that you study, is going to have a desire for domination of his nation and the people around him. And this is particularly true of empires. But it's also important to understand that the ideal for such leaders is not simply conquest, but it is to do what is right. And this was the case of Sennacherib. And it's important that historians who understand history from a wider perspective, not just simply narrow their historical understanding to this nation and that nation and attempt to characterize it in the way that we saw that scholar from Cambridge do about the Assyrians, that they had a very dark view of history, but also to try to understand them from their perspective. And so I think it's very important to really truly understand the principles upon which the Assyrians viewed their policies based on. And here he tells us he is the guardian of the right. In other words, there is a sense of right and wrong, and there is a sense of justice. And Sennacherib takes pride in the fact that he is a lover of justice. He wants to do what is right, who lends support and comes to the aid of the weak. Sennacherib also becomes well known in history through various Aramaic sources. And one of the sources that, in addition to the Bible, of course, in addition to Western sources that I want to talk to you about, is that the story of Achiqar Hakima, or Achiqar the Wise, where Sennacherib is a kind of a king who is highly praised and loved, and one should give his loyalty to. And this is told in a story where Achiqar is the vizier or the wise man of King Sennacherib. And so, without going into great detail here, Achiqar praises, otherwise known as Haikar, praises the Assyrian king as he tells the pharaoh to stand up and listen to how I'm going to speak about my lord Sennacherib. My Lord is the God of heaven, and his nobles are the lightnings and the thunder. And when he wills, the winds blow and the rains fall. And he commands the thunder, and it lightens and rains. And he holds the sun, and it gives not its light, and the moon and the stars, and they circle not. And so the point is that Sennacherib controls a lot, that he has a lot of power, and he also has, in the form of Haikar or Achiqar, much wisdom. So these are sources that were found in Aramaic scrolls, and these Aramaic scrolls are, of course, very important. Why weren't they found in Akkadian? It's just the way they came down to us, and it's important to understand that the Assyrians wrote in both Akkadian and Aramaic. Now, in addition to knowing Sennacherib as a great leader, as Haikar or Achiqar portrays him to be, in addition to portraying or knowing that Sennacherib is a great military commander, which he takes great pride in specifically in settling all the disputes of the empire, Sennacherib also takes a lot of pride in building projects that he engages in, specifically in building, once he is crowned prince under his father, Sargon II, he assists in building what is known as Dur Sharukin, one of Syria's greatest cities, one of the greatest architectural and artistic wonders of the Assyrian Empire. He also takes a lot of pride in building one of the greatest aqueducts in history. This aqueduct was the largest ever built, and it brings water to Nineveh, and it could still be seen on Google Earth. In other words, through satellite, it could still be seen from the sky. And the Assyrians did incredible work in this area to bring water. So sophisticated was the work that even today it is not replicated. And you could see these stones today in northern Iraq, from the area of Duhok, coming all the way down to the ancient city of Nineveh and other Assyrian cities. In other words, their path and the stones used by the great Assyrian King Sennacherib is still there. And Sennacherib tells us, over a great distance, I had a watercourse directed to the environs of Nineveh. Joining together the waters over steep-sided valleys, I span an aqueduct of white limestone blocks. I made those waters flow over it. One could imagine that this would have been a very beautiful sight and a very wondrous sight, and it would have drawn many people from the countryside into the cities because it created a wonderful water supply for the cities, such that it had not been seen before. So this was Sennacherib's legacy of being the builder of Assyria, as he liked to praise himself. Now, in history, as we discussed before, we also have kind of legendary characters, and it is thought oftentimes that, according to Greek writings, that Semiramis and Nebuchadnezzar had built the gardens of Babylon. But was this true? Well, no. Apparently, according to many scholars, Sennacherib was the one really responsible for building the wondrous gardens in Nineveh specifically, and not Babylon. So what we know as the hanging gardens of Babylon were really the hanging gardens of Nineveh, and their builder was not Nebuchadnezzar, as is thought in historical legend, but actually Sennacherib. And this is a rendering of what the gardens may have looked like according to both Assyrian sources and the latest scholarship that we have. And specifically, Sennacherib tells us that he raised the height of the surrounding palace to be a wonder for all peoples. I gave the name Incomparable Palace, or in other words, Palace Without Rival. This is the name of a book of one particular scholar. A high garden imitating the Amanus Mountains I laid out next to it, with all kinds of aromatic plants, orchard fruit trees, trees that enrich not only Babylon, not only the mountain country, but also Chaldea, in other words, in the south, as well as trees that bear wool, cotton, which was from India, planted within it. So this garden that Sennacherib created is the only thing that we know of in Mesopotamia that resembles what we call the garden, the hanging gardens of Babylon. And Sennacherib, in his artistic work, he portrays a lot of building activity, a lot of people engaging in various efforts to bring wood and to bring other building material to build his palace, including winged bulls that are carved out of limestone and granite and so on, into the gardens in Nineveh. And you could see in some of the reliefs that there were thousands of people working on these sites from different parts of the empire. According to Stephanie Daly, the palace and the garden go together to form the wonder for all peoples, in the words of Sennacherib. And this wonder is, of course, the hanging gardens of what we knew before as Babylon. Sennacherib, as we said before, was the son and successor of Sargon II. Sennacherib was entrusted with governing the empire, and he had done a very good job. His wife was Tashmitu Sharat, who he was married to, and also then he marries Naqiya Zakutu after her, and he may have had relations with other women. Now it is said that Sennacherib is one of the few Assyrian kings who exclaimed much about his love, his deep love for his queen, and he tells us in one stele that his wife is a beloved spouse and his queen, and he praises her as a great beauty, and he expressed the wish to live with her in the palace in, quote, physical and emotional bliss for all time to come. And this is rather rare. Now, Sennacherib, like other Assyrian kings, had what we called a harem in history. Now, Assyrians practiced monogamy, in other words, one man, one woman in their marriages. But for the kings, the rule was a little bit different, and that's the way it was with King Sennacherib as it was with his father as well. Sennacherib's oldest son was Ashur-nadin Shumi. He was appointed to become king of Babylon, and he had ruled in Babylon for some time before being unfortunately kidnapped, and he had been killed, most likely in Elam. In other words, kidnapped in Babylon by most likely Elamites or others who conspired against him in Babylon, and he was sent to Elam and eventually killed there. Now, Assyrian sources tended to be very silent about the death or killing of Assyrian kings because it was a show of weakness to have an Assyrian king killed. It was a great deal of taboo surrounding this topic. So there's not much discussed, but certainly Sennacherib expresses a great deal of anger and rage towards Babylon because of the treatment of his oldest son. There were other royal princes, and these were Urdu Mulisi specifically. Urdu Mulisi is really next in line because the others are not recipients of kind of the royal favor. However, Urdu Mulisi becomes the favorite of Sennacherib, but the problem here for Sennacherib is that he decides to later choose, even though he allows Urdu Mulisi to be a crown prince for a number of years, he chooses Sarhaddun instead. And so this really drives a wedge between Sennacherib and others in the kingdom, including many supporters of Urdu Mulisi. And Urdu Mulisi, of course, understandably is upset, and he decides to take the law, as it were, in his own hands, and he assassinates his father, Sennacherib. Sarhaddun tells us this: of my older brothers, the younger brother was I, but by decree of the gods Ashur and Shamash, Bel and Nebu, my father exalted me. Amid a gathering of my brothers, he asked Shamash, "Is this my heir?" The gods answered, "He is your second self." And then my brothers went mad. They drew their swords godlessly in the middle of Nineveh, meaning they did the unthinkable, which was to rebel against the Assyrian state and the Assyrian monarch. But Ashur, Shamash, Bel, Nebu, and Ishtar, all the gods, looked with wrath on the deeds of these scoundrels, brought their strength to weakness, and humbled them beneath me. He doesn't talk much about the killing of his father. Again, the subject is a great deal of taboo. There's a great deal of taboo involved here. But it is mentioned in the Bible that, in the Old Testament, that King Sennacherib was, when he was worshiping in the temple, he was slain at that time. And now we get to the tragic part of the tale. When you go to the University of Chicago and you see specifically the artwork, the sculptures from Dur Sharukin, which is the city built by Sargon II, which Sennacherib, of course, had a hand in. He took a great deal of pride in that. You will see on the right-hand side, as you're looking at the winged bull, on the right-hand side, you will see an interesting figure following the crown prince. Now, you will know the crown prince, and in this case, it is Sennacherib, because remember, the city was ruled by King Sargon II, and the crown prince is Sennacherib, his son, and he wears the tiara with the flowing ribbons attached to it, and this is the sign of the crown prince. Now, behind him is what used to be a bearded figure, and this bearded figure has become what we call in Assyrian history a eunuch. A eunuch is a castrated male who cannot grow a beard. He cannot father children, obviously, because he's castrated. So when you look at this figure, you see that someone has removed his beard, and you wonder why. Why was a beard placed on this figure and then taken off? And the theory of most scholars is that this was Urdumulisi, the son of Sennacherib, and that at the time the city was built, the relationship between Sennacherib, the crown prince, and his son Urdumulisi was fine. Everything was okay. But then, when Sennacherib was killed, people went back to where this relief was, and in order to desecrate the memory of Urdumulisi, they had him, in effect, artistically castrated by removing his beard. And so it was left for all times in history to wonder, as a kind of a final act of revenge against the murderer of Sennacherib. And this was, of course, a desecration of the highest order in the Assyrian kingdom, not only to slay the king, but also to slay one's father, something that was unheard of before, something that was certainly completely unacceptable, a sin beyond any sin that is known in the Assyrian Empire. So it is thought that this figure is Urdumulisi, and it is thought that this figure was desecrated, his artistic image was desecrated because of the killing of Sennacherib. So what we know about Sennacherib is that he was a great builder, according to the archaeological record. He was a person who felt that he protected the weak, maintained the order of the empire, was a great engineer, a great strategist, had done the best he could, but had made one fatal mistake by removing one who was placed in the position of crown prince by replacing him with someone else. And so that was his sin against Urdumulisi, for which Urdumulisi paid his father with his death. So we will stop here, and we will discuss in the next lecture the son who came after Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, or Esarhaddon. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.